Febria give us a talk titled Harnessing Diversity in Freshwater Restoration Science to celebrate Asian Heritage Month. Before that, we want to do the land acknowledgement first. The University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of three pharaohs or confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the long-standing relationship with First Nation people in this place, in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits of Detroit. Thank you. Before I pass it over to Dr. Shi, I would like to point out that please make sure that your microphone is muted. And if you have questions, feel free to save them in our Q&A session and type in the Q&A box. Our talk will be recorded. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Shi.
Thank you, Chen Kai. Today we gather here to celebrate and honor Asian heritage by inviting a remarkable individual who embodies excellence in her field and a steadfast commitment to environmental stewardship. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce you Dr. Catherine Febria to you. She is a Canada Research Chair who has made significant contributions to the restoration and preservation of freshwater ecosystems. In 2019, Dr. Febria conceived and established the Healthy Headwaters Lab, driven by a profound mission to restore the health of our freshwater ecosystems for the benefit of harnessing their unique talents and fostering a culture of collaboration, research excellence, and global impact. Her research is deeply rooted in decolonization and anti-colonization, embracing a holistic perspective and prioritizing partnerships as the driving force behind her work. Her research informs a long-term vision for real-world experimentation that underpins whole ecosystems recovery within the social ecological framework. Dr. Febria's contributions extend far beyond the realms of the natural science. She is an exceptional bridge builder, fostering collaboration and understanding between the natural and social sciences, and also among different diverse cultures and traditions in Canada and across the world. So now let's please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Febria to the presentation. So let's join me to give her a warm welcome. Please, Dr. Catherine Febria. Now turn this floor to you, Dr. Catherine Febria.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
And you can see my slides and you can see me okay?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that feedback. With my presentation slides on, I'm unable to see you all, but I'm so grateful to be here today. I'm so grateful to the invitation that was extended to me, and especially in honor of Asian Heritage Month, because it is, it is my journey and lived experience to be here as an immigrant to Canada. I wanted to first open in a good way and really situate yourself and myself in the work that I'll be talking to you about today. Ani Buju, kumusta? Magandang gabi sa inyo lahat. Catherine Febria, Indigenous Cause, Philippines, Indunjaba. My name is Catherine, and I am a scientist, and I'm also a daughter, a granddaughter, an auntie, and a mom. I'm also very grateful to share with you stories about how diversity has been a gift and a strategy in the science that we pursue here in the Healthy Headwaters Lab. So I'll be taking you to different places today to explain to you how and the ways in which diversity has played a critical role in addressing some of our freshwater science challenges. And to do that, I wanted to extend a miigwech or salamat to the Great Lakes Basin. I'll be talking a little bit about work that I've done in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as acknowledging, my ancestry and my story that landed me here from the islands of Luzon and Leyte as a descendant of Filipino people. So I'm grateful to be with you tonight and celebrate this this month. I also, as a scientist, really was drawn to water and as a person have always been drawn to water. So I wanted to open this circle of gratitude by acknowledging those small streams. That's where I really spent a lot of time as a researcher, getting to know these streams that are often invisible, because that's what intermittent streams do. And as a PhD student, under the supervision of Dudley Williams, I was given permission to play in these creeks and drains and understand the relationship between land and water and this interface called the hyporheic zone. It was such a gift and a privilege to study these streams and understand just how important they are for ecosystems and for society, and yet how they remain underprotected and underappreciated even today. I wanted to express my gratitude to the Decho, or the Mackenzie Delta, in the Northwest Territories, where I went as a master's student and learned so much about how dynamic our water can be, how these beautiful systems can teach us so much about variability and how the resilience to things like climate change. And it was here where I really became so interested in the tools that we can use in ecosystem ecology, fingerprinting carbon and microbes at a landscape scale, and understand the relationship that humans have had with water, and how we can really how we can use our science in a way to address some of our pressing challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. I extend my circle of gratitude to the Chesapeake Bay, which is the watersheds where I first became a mom. And you can see my postdoc supervisor, Margaret Palmer, who taught me so much about what it meant to pivot my science towards being more actionable, to being policy relevant, to being situated and harnessing societal and human dimensions. And by doing that and engaging in this and becoming a bridge, we can make our science more impactful. It's here where I really retooled a lot of my science toolbox. I filled it up with a number of other things like synthesis, and really looked at how restoration has been conducted, not only in the Chesapeake Bay, but around the world, how we can measure the health of an ecosystem in so many different ways: diversity and functions, ecosystem status, look at functional rates, to really understand and monitor the health, and also realize the shocking truth that we weren't really doing it in a consistent way to help us understand if restoration was working, and even understand the ways in which restoration, for the large part, although it is quite expensive, is actually showing very little or slow progress. And it really got me and turned me on a path towards wanting to mobilize science and use it in a way that could be effective and impactful today. My science's journey took me to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so I wanted to extend my gratitude to the waters of Te Waiponamu, the people and the science communities there that really, really gave me permission to be a scientist, do that work seriously, but not take myself too seriously. It was a space where early career researchers could be fostered, and where I found my voice and way of leading in a way that was, compassionate, but also truly as effective as a scientist provider. And it's this group of people that really, again, also shaped my way of thinking about how to really understand our rights and responsibilities as treaty partners, and the ways in which science in a community engaged way could be truly more impactful. And you also have a lot of fun doing it. So this was us at one of our freshwater science conferences nights. You can see just how serious we take our science. But I also wanted to extend my gratitude to this global community of freshwater scientists, of conservation scientists, of people around the world. And in this photo, it was a privilege to be one of the inaugural early career fellows in IPBES, the biodiversity equivalent to the IPCC, the International Platform on Climate Change. It's an intentional platform supported by nations around the world to ensure that science, biodiversity science, is mobilized and put into the hands of nations to make decisions like our global biodiversity framework, which was just ratified and decided on just a few months ago. It's here where we did research on the importance of early career researchers to build that bridge between science and policy. And again, once you go down these paths, there's no way to do anything any differently than to try and make room and space for different ways of doing science. And so I will situate you for the most part of today's talk here in the Great Lakes, in the place that we call home. Literally, the lakes are Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. So people in our group, we often call ourselves the homies. We feel really driven to connect science, use science to connect land, water, and people. And we do it in a way that's so intentional and thinking about how can we use the gifts that we're given, science, creative, other gifts, to really focus on this goal. And this is where, again, where places that ground me are really thinking about places and people such as the next generation. All of these journeys that I've taken as a scientist has really shaped the Healthy Headwaters Lab as we now know it. It was a lab that we started and that I started when I relocated from Aotearoa, New Zealand, back to Canada. And it was really, again, this intentional decision to try and create a lab and a culture where we could be values driven, where we could take anti-colonial methodology and put it into practice. We could be intentionally interdisciplinary, engaged and centered by the communities that engage in freshwater restoration and stewardship. And that if we could do that and create a space where those things could happen, and the science would be transformative, and that societal outcomes would be beneficial. And all of these would help us redefine and give rich example to what research excellence means. So for those that might just be tuning in and are not scientists, I'll just quickly start by talking about diversity as an ecological concept. I think about diversity all the time, and its very basic definition is really thinking about the different kinds and combinations of living and non-living beings and the ecosystems across the planet. So if you were to imagine, your favorite ecosystems and the places that you live, diversity is around us, not only in the kinds of species that speak to us, places we might have traveled to, habitats all around us. It includes not only the natural kind of pristine environments, but also our built environment, our our garden, our pollinator garden, we might plant right outside of our house. It might be the stormwater pond that has now been, naturalized and added with wetland plants. It might be places of rich spiritual and cultural significance. All of the ways in which we engage with nature, the living and non-living beings and ecosystems around that. That's what I'm talking about, the diversity of all living things and those relationships across it. This appreciation and this deep connection to ecosystems and to the diversity of ecological systems and processes is what really guides a lot of our science. And when we look at how we as a society have gotten to this place of climate change and biodiversity loss, it can sometimes be a little bit disappointing or a little bit frustrating to know what are the ways in which we can restore our ecosystems for the benefit of future generations. We can look to the science and find that if we look at examples of where the most impactful research and effective management around the world have taken place, it is in those places where Indigenous and local knowledges have been maximized and fully engaged from the beginning. The science is clear that some of our best examples, even here in what we now call Canada, are places like river communities and salmon communities in the Pacific Northwest, in Vancouver, BC, northwestern BC, where we have Indigenous-led river restoration, thinking about restoring livelihoods in salmon fisheries for future generations. And so it's really clear that, if we aren't really thinking about or purposely engaging human dimensions in our science, then it's really just bad science. So I really wanted to find ways to train people in this space, because I know that what we're doing here is globally relevant. Some of us might be thinking about, some of the global challenges. We might all be working in different spaces, thinking and hoping that what we're doing is speaking towards these global goals that we know are required for a more sustainable planet. We sometimes call these the SDGs. And while I worked specifically on goal 14, which is life below water, it actually is very all-encompassing, because we can't have life on land and peace and economic growth without a healthy relationship with our water systems. So in thinking globally, it's really clear, again, the science tells us and shows us that the global solution is local. And so I hope if you really think about, a few key things from today's lecture, that thinking about your local ecosystems and having an enriching relationship with where your water is and what your relationship is with your watershed. If you do nothing else but appreciate the local beings around you, then I feel like I will have achieved this my goal for this talk. And here, where we are in the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Gawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, in a highly human, settled, and working landscape, the reality of our local waterways is this. Like many of you probably see these roadside ditches and think, probably don't think much about what kind of biodiversity is here, but this is one of the most common freshwater ecosystems in the region and many of the regions where we live. If you live in a city, if you live on a farm, most likely this is one of the most common freshwater habitats that you might see around you. Or maybe it's something like this, an urban stream, culverted, maybe buried, maybe you don't even know where a stream is because it's been buried or bulldozed. And so this is the reality of the kind of ecosystems that the most common types of ecosystems that we are working with and that many of you are living in and around. And so it's no surprise that, right now we're at the beginning, the gateway of this decade of ecosystem restoration, where globally the call is we need to think about our local systems. We need to champion those local solutions to try and address this larger problem of erosion, pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change. And so it really was important to say, knowing all of that, knowing this lived experience, knowing the evidence, knowing the reality of where we live, work, and play, it was really clear to me that the solution would be diversity. So as a scientific strategy. A lot of my training and a lot of my research on this is that is global. If we look at examples of where some of the most innovative science has emerged, it really has been in labs and spaces where investments in diversity have been showing winning results. So you can imagine diverse research collaborations that have different perspectives and different ways of knowing and doing. And this is ultimately a strength. It also, in doing this work and being on this journey, it allowed me to really help co-create and foster communities like Kindness in Science, which is a community in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we actively engage in trying to hold science spaces accountable to treaty responsibilities, where in these spaces it's equal Māori and non-Māori scientists at different levels of career stages, from early career practitioners and students all the way to people in senior higher management. And it's in these spaces where, again, I could really feel supported in trying to advocate for better science. What this looks like here in the Great Lakes, for me, one way this looks like is incredibly diverse teams. This is just a few of the different types of talented people that have called HHL, our lab, our home, our training grounds. They study, some of them aren't even on campus, they're based in their community. Some of them love invertebrate species like mussels. Some of them love the molecular attributes of water and carbon. Some of them are great at vegetational biodiversity. Others love the connections between all of those things. And so it's a privilege to be working and really, really accounting for and making space for as many different perspectives as possible. And so I look forward to sharing some of their stories today. So the science that we do includes benthic invertebrates. It includes all of those small animals that live at the bottom of streams and rivers that we often don't pay attention to. So I encourage you to pick up a rock and take a look at what's living. It includes vegetational biodiversity, looking at plant communities. And again, these often overlooked, you drive right by them, sorts of streams, these drain ecosystems that are so commonplace across the region. It also means that we can measure water in so many different ways, looking at water quality and the different ways in which nutrients and organisms interact with their environment. And it allows us to also take water and generate pictures of its complexity, such as looking at the relationship between carbon and microbes by simply looking at a fingerprint, a fingerprint of our water, in other words, an excitation emission matrix or an EAM. We can generate numbers of a model based on hundreds and hundreds of samples. This is the kind of work we've been doing over the last few years to generate a picture of this carbon landscape, ultimately the building blocks of all life, carbon, to understand what are the relationships with the urban and agricultural landscapes, restored ones, and have a richer picture of how long and what kinds of actions might it require to restore our ecosystems back to full health. So we really engage the local landscape. For us, it means streams and wetlands and agricultural landscapes and urban settings. And it allows us, again, to do this work locally and in a very rooted way. So we're not flying into different places and sampling once. We have been getting to know these streams season after season, year after year. So another way we can think about diversity is this term called pluralism. So it as a concept is also something we put into practice. In the broadest sense, pluralism is in line with complexity and systems thinking. So it's really a way of designing our teams. And pluralism directly addresses diversity with some aspect of the natural or human culture. So when we use the word diversity, it is evocative of a positive attribute in the context of our human and natural systems. So how are the ways that we operationalize the things that we value? How do we do this thing, which is using science for good, as a tool for peace, as a way to reconnect land and water and future generations? We operationalize this term of diversity. We understand that there's different ways of doing science, and it's going to be key to the innovation in our team. We also know the evidence is clear that it's taken generations for our ecosystems to get to this level of degradation. It will take generations for us to recover the kinds of attributes, all in a changing climate. But there's no shortcut to ethical and equitable research partnerships. And if we can engage human dimensions and be scientists who are capable and confident to do that work, then our science will be equally and readily mobilized into decision making. So our lab and our team is often referred to or considered to be some type of boundary organization or a bridge between science and society. And while it's such a privilege to do that work, it is truly by design. We are very intentional about a knowledge co-production process, where before we go in with our gear to any ecosystems, to any roadside ditch or backyard wetland, we engage in trust-based relationships with our community. We have dozens upon dozens of individual MOU with farmers and community partners to do this work and understand the local conditions within which science should be impactful or should be informing. In having these relational circles and meeting and forming teams that include local knowledge holders, we can identify key research gaps and uncertainties and barriers to implementation. So instead of studying A, maybe B might be the thing that the farmers might take up or a local decision maker might make. So we can co-create research. Everyone has agency and ownership of that. And the outcomes are a lot more readily understood because we've taken the time to understand if something doesn't fail, these are potential reasons why, or these are lessons that will be learned. And the best way to do that is to have and embed multiple modes of knowledge mobilization and feedback so that, again, we are all on this journey together. And so I'll show you a number of different ways. You can see elements of all of these things in every project that we invest in. Again, it doesn't happen by accident, it is by design. So we have a diversity of roles. And here's just a timeline of where we began in 2019. It was important, again, to start in a good way. And so we created an Indigenous allyship program, which has now evolved into a beautiful space-giving place called Odemi in the Indigenous Knowledge Circle. But we started in 2019 with, myself and Candy Donaldson, and we've continued to expand this circle of like-minded people who share values and wanting to work in this way. We also hired a senior agricultural advisor, so farmer, who helped us bridge and broker connections to understand the local farming community. And a number of different project coordinators. Again, before we did science, we set up an infrastructure to support the roles of things like an Indigenous scholar, a lab storyteller, and to help support our different projects in the community. Like everyone, we got COVIDed out. We had to move and pivot online, and there was just as much work with this global pandemic, but we still were able to, because of those relationships, continue on with fieldwork. We were able to hold symposia and continue to do the relationship building that we had started. And the stories become richer and richer. Again, it's by design, and we want to learn from the process. And so we often have a reflexive practice to understand where, what did we do and where and how, what worked, so that we can, again, continue to plan and invest in relationships. So diversity or pluralism is also a funding strategy by thinking about, how, again, knowing that science shows us that doesn't happen by osmosis, how could we invest in these projects? And so these dots represent some of our grants. One way, as an ecologist, I think about connectivity and relationships. So could we ensure that our research based relationships were funded? So these are all the different types of grants that we looked and received in the first couple of years. And you can see that we made sure that every project had some connection to our local knowledge holders or communities that would best benefit and support that work. So that includes NDWJ, which is Nindawajig, the Walpole Island Heritage Centers that had their own grants that we were able to then also co and partner with. So taking an ecological and enhanced diversity approach is, again, it does take a lot of work, but it has resulted in really rich science stories and success stories. It allows us to train people and to really develop some theory to advance how we might go about restoring our ecosystems by thinking about interactions. We can think about, one of our largest theory of change for doing restoration is the fact that we know that these systems and the communities that are in our waterways are those that have survived a lot of stress, generations of sediment stress, land conversion, and habitat destruction. So the animals and the plants that we see in these drains are superheroes in a sense that they survived a lot of stress. So when we think about trying to reintroduce other diversity native plants, other fish, other species that we want to see, we often think about the aim of restoration is to promote positive attributes of resistance and resilience, to overcome negative resistance. So there's lots of evidence around the world where they've restored something and the species haven't changed, or it's taken along, water quality hasn't improved. That is an example of negative resistance and resilience. The species that are there can withstand good and bad conditions. So if we want to reintroduce the species we desire and have positive interactions, it's going to take more than just one step. It's going to take, again, generational investment in nurturing our ecosystems back to full health. So what does this look like when we invest in a sort of plural strategy? Diverse outcomes emerge. And I'll take you to Aotearoa, New Zealand for this part. New Zealand often seems very far away, but in a few slides you'll realize it's very similar to a lot of the sort of conditions that we are facing. New Zealand is known for having these river floodplain ecosystems, one of the most rarest ecosystems on the planet. But also, like Canada and many settled places around the world, the landscape has been converted into and intensified for agricultural land uses. So much so that this low gradient plains, which is much like the gradient here in the Lake Erie Basin, that fish habitat has been lost. So we have species at risk concerns there, but also things like water quality issues downstream, algal blooms, and the same sorts of issues that we experience here in the Great Lakes. So for 5 years, I worked as a science director for the Canterbury Waterway Rehabilitation Experiment, CAREX, and it's here where we co-created experiments with our farming partners. We generated through discussion a toolbox of solutions, and we talked to a number of different knowledge users from individual farmers, government agencies, community science groups, and we developed tools that would be not only within the stream, but at the edge of the farm field, in that riparian setting, within the channel margins, and finally within streams. This idea that it would take many tools and many things to achieve a successful outcome. So here's one of these typical waterways. They look very similar to some of our agricultural drains here in Ontario and across North America, where there is like drainage ditches that help facilitate water to not flood farm fields. Our PhD student at the time, Katie, was very interested to finding solutions to this invasive plant situation that really was blocking the streams and reducing biodiversity. Well, she tested a hypothesis that involved bringing back the banks, having community science groups, community groups plant native plant species at certain widths and certain assemblages of it to test the hypothesis that we could find plants to outcompete the invasives if we chose the right ones based on their traits. And sure enough, 2 years later, that experiment led to this waterway being, propagated by many native plants that eventually started to self-seed. And the plants that we planted at the water's edge, carex, outcompeted a lot of that invasive weed to the point where there was no further need for like drainage maintenance, and we had a flourishing ecosystem downstream. And this was one of 9 different waterways we worked in on that time. And in addition to doing the science, it wasn't really just our best hypothesis that allowed us to do a lot of this place-based work, but partnerships that help generate co-benefits in agricultural stream restoration. So in addition to our experiment, different groups were able to then, amplify this work in 4 additional kilometers in the same watershed, thanks to a nonprofit group and a school group. Microbial scientists were able to identify that the sediment traps not only were useful for stopping sediment, they were also really good for combating things like E. coli pollution. It allowed us to also leverage partnerships at the federal level with the national science organizations and economic, Doc Fonterra, the federal conservation and the largest company for all of New Zealand. And it was also here where we met with farmers and met with Indigenous knowledge holders about how restoring our agricultural landscapes really work towards a shared vision for this landscape. And so it was really a nice example of how we can move towards ethical and equitable partnerships in research. And that's really where our work is situated, and where I feel so much has been taught to me and revalidated about if we plan and commit to doing research in an ethical, equitable way, really incredible outcomes can emerge. It starts with thinking about generational, timescales. Science is often funded in a few years, which is too short of a time to see ecological change. It's too short of a time scale to invest in generational thinking and generational level outcomes. So here are some ways in which that we've been able to implement some place-based science through our farm, our advisory board, and our ecological research network, as well as through ODAMIN, our Indigenous Knowledge Circle. One way by investing in these relationships is that we've been able to use these carbon molecular tools in a context where so much focus has been placed on phosphorus and nitrogen. We can also now pivot and look more broadly at carbon, which is the binding kind of a nutrient and an attribute that binds nutrients to it. So if we can look at carbon, which is literally a measure of the plants and the different animals in our spaces, we can actually use that as a tool to help us understand restoration timelines. What does that mean? Well, most of the science on agricultural conservation is usually focused on the difference between conventional agriculture, so full tillage of soil, to no-till, where you don't till any soil. When actually a lot of the processes that we try to mimic is that of carbon, trying to keep soil organic carbon in the soil to support greater plants. By talking to our farm network, we were able to learn that in Windsor-Essex County, there is a rich array of different land use practices that include not only tillage, but conservation tillage, bringing animals through pasture, as well as restoring farmlands to forest. And so many of our projects, like those listed here, have expanded our gradient to include not just these binary categories of farming, but a gradient of different approaches to farming to help illustrate to us that restored forests, maybe 50 to 75 years old, still, it takes that long to start to see changes in the carbon that's required to sequester and keep these soils healthy. So it gives us some baseline understanding for, what kinds of conservation actions that need to happen. It will probably take decades to see that kind of significant change that we're wanting. So maybe we can do more intentional kind of conservation and practices in sequences and combinations to help accelerate the kind of carbon recovery we'd like to see in a healthy landscape. It also, looking at species in these waterways, these agricultural landscapes, we've been able to form rich partnerships. One of the watersheds we have the privilege of working in is called the Sydenham River Watershed, which feeds into Lake St. Clair and Bikeshwanong Territory or Walpole Island First Nation. Through our partnerships with local conservation practitioners and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we've been able to explore the distributions of these special invertebrates. Many people might not even know that these mussels exist, but that river system has the most it's the most biodiverse watershed in all of Canada for freshwater mussels. So we've been participating in research that is expanding our knowledge of distribution of these species at risk, but also doing it in partnership. We've also been able to show that just focusing on the mussels, we're losing the picture of who those mussels interact with. And one of our graduates, Roland, was able to demonstrate, as well as with research from Dante, that benthic invertebrates, the rest of the insects that mussels live with, some of them are really highly correlated with mussel SARS. So we really need one to inform the other. It also was able to, this sort of work in partnership-based work allows us to extend and sample places that haven't been looked at before. We're able to harmonize data sets. We brought together 94 different data points between 3 different organizations, including our own, to find that there is high complementarity, but also a lot of gaps. And maybe this way, conservation of the species in that watershed could be more strategic in the future. And sort of that's the work that we're deeply engaged in now, and acknowledge Julia and many other students involved in those projects. By looking at things like mussel communities, it's really introduced us to assessing the kinds of policy and practices that are in place for these species at risk. So we were invited into a project to look and assess whether or not restoration for mussels is working. The common practice when there's infrastructure projects like a bridge or a subwater development, if that's ever to take place anywhere in Canada, and we know that there's a sensitive population of mussels, the common practice for the last 15 years is to move them upstream. It's perhaps shocking to know that after 15 years of this practice, we're the first team to actually open that data set and revisit those sites to find that actually, if you move those mussels, there hasn't been a systematic approach to it, and it is quite disappointing in terms of their recovery. So they aren't doing well post-recovery, and we're trying to figure out questions why. And so acknowledging Lauren, who's actually now a PhD student in this project, there's so many rich questions that we want to address to improve our efforts for conserving these critical species. It also allows us again, through partnerships to think about, who do those species live in with other species at risk. So we do a little bit of fish work, and we are looking at how habitat, conservation often happens separate from habitat restoration. So we're able to bring these things together to look at how can we ensure that species at risk reintroduction in Ontario streams are really successful. But again, all of these different projects have the ability to change policy and practice and relationships. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today's talk, you realize that it really is those relationships and not our best hypotheses that really get us to this point of science impact. And so relationships must always come first with other teams, with community, with each other, and the landscapes that we work on. And again, this doesn't happen by accident. It is very intentional. In New Zealand and other projects, it was really clear that people are not reading our scientific peer-reviewed publications. I know scientists, we work very hard on those things, and they are very important. But they also are not enough. And so we would mobilize findings from our scientific papers into plain language, common, just downloadable, freely available tip sheets. And there's more than 50 of them for Carex. And we have a number of public, our posters and other outputs on our website and on our public scholar page to mobilize this information as we're doing it, to really make transparent the scientific process and really, again, keep us accountable to ensuring that the science that we're pursuing is relevant and useful to the communities that need them. Relationships also mean doing science in a context of our history on this continent, in Turtle Island. In Canada, through the pandemic and since, and for a long time before that, there has been a call for us to become more, again, ethical in our relationships as scientists. And one of the key things that we think about and do is how can we use our science as one of many things we can do as reconciliation with Indigenous peoples' lands and water. And so it is really important that we think about that, we consider that, we think about all of the small ways that we can be accountable and be just authentic in our relationships. This has really fostered a space of growth and joy in Odemian. And so I wanted to acknowledge the scientists in our team within the university and in their communities who are using all of their gifts to really, again, center their relationships and use their gifts to really connect with restoring stewardship actions and conservation in the places that we all care about. We're often asked as a team, how do we use traditional ecological knowledge and use Indigenous knowledge? And it's certainly a question that I'm still on this journey wanting to do it right. And it's really clear that knowledge is really not for me as a dominant trained scientist to use or access, but it really is been the biggest teacher in upholding and respecting self-determination and understanding the privileges that I have as a scientist, that we can critically, collaboratively change systems and policies and practices, and I've seen nothing but really incredibly important relationships and learning and teachings emerge, and just really wonderful things that have emerged by committing to doing this work in a good way. One of those things include our first traditional ecological knowledge field course at Bikajurong right before the pandemic, really trying to, again, get our learning and the teachings away from campus and onto the land. It was such an incredibly exciting and important activity and exercise to do together, but it was really important to see that so much could come, and the reflections that came from the students who participated in this work really speak for itself. We're all on that journey, but creating spaces for everyone to do that learning on the land from knowledge keepers and, in relationship to one another was really a privilege to witness. We also see storytelling emerge. So we have, a number of creative people who have found ways to use their voice, use their art, use their gifts to connect their way of knowing and doing and science in a good way. So I wanted to acknowledge the work of our inaugural artist, Mariah Alexander, who created this piece, I Am One With Everything, that has gone on to be a commissioned work for the International Joint Commission, and also created the Ojibwe nature coloring book, which you can find at the Nature Center. If you're here in Windsor, you can download it for free, as well as, you know, the talents and the gifts of so many people in our science communication team who, under the directorship of Cheyenne Nolan and our team, have been able to really launch a social media platform that is so, again, data-driven. We know people have individual relationships with science, and we wanted to meet them where they are. We wanted people to reconnect with waterways, even if they're in urban or farm settings. And, you know, we have a lot of wonderful stories emerging from who's engaging with our different platforms, who is accessing information, and how, you know, we're starting to see, again, many rich interactions with people in these places. And it is good validation that, you know, the importance of storytelling in the kinds of enacting and supporting positive change. And of course, the kinds of relationships, like I wanted to acknowledge the next generation who have been teaching us so much, and the Bikajirong Eco Keepers, the Indigenous stewards here in the city of Windsor's Ojibwe Park have taught us so much about, you know, what the importance of creating spaces where for that learning to happen. And I look forward to continuing to work with them again. They are the future, and it's been a privilege to be able to use our science in the spaces that we can create as nothing but like training and partnership spaces. So I wanted to kind of come back to reflecting on this talk of how we've harnessed diversity to try and address this really challenging space of freshwater restoration in this decade of ecosystem restoration at a time when there is so much stress on this planet. And there certainly have been many challenges in doing this work. And I know it's been only 4 years, but we've learned so much about how to do ethical research, how to do partnerships, and how to honor those partnerships. It's true, it takes longer. You know, if you're a science person to invest in these, there are very few funding mechanisms to do it. You know, science has been used. There are biases in it, in the way it's approached. You know, it's very often in the dominant science culture that hyperlocal research or community work is less robust or less rigorous. And there are always power dynamics and conflicts. These have all really underpinned, I think, the delays that we're seeing in restoring our planet, restoring our local ecosystems. And so with even given all of those challenges, the benefits are also true. The trust-based relationships have allowed us to weather things like COVID. It's allowed true partnership. And, you know, the work of how to do it right, like that is the good work. You know, how do we engage funders? How do we redesign funding mechanisms? How do we acknowledge that the learning that we do as a process in itself is progress? And how do we try and create spaces for people to learn, even if we are a work in progress? But ultimately, the things that we've seen that I think speak for itself is the validation, the legitimization of the work that we have with local communities who might be taking that up, the knowledge that's shared, and integration into things like science, policy, and practice. So I hope that today, thinking about this term of diversity, we can rethink and reframe science, but also how we fund it, the outcomes we might expect from it, and ultimately the impact. In doing this work, it's been very important to invest in the next generation. One of the things that COVID introduced was, you know, this immediate draw to move on online. And it was a privilege to work with our partners at Wayne State, just literally across the river. I could sort of see them here, the city of Detroit from our shore, to work with early career researchers who were really wanting and desperate for a connection with other peers. We were able to take a traditional science seminar and make it virtual and really create a framework for collaboration and innovation to take place, and to the point where the students published on this work to show how this is what's transformative. But if we can co-develop things, if we can showcase early career researchers, you know, we really are training and empowering the next generation. For people who are looking, students maybe who would like to continue to work in this sort of framework, it's a privilege to work in FishCast, which is a federally funded graduate training program, where by design, you're, in addition, and sort of aside from your thesis research, you are taking up internship placements in the community, with government, with nonprofits, as well as building a network specifically designed to overcome some of those systemic barriers of participation. So we have micro credentials to allow people to become upskilled in quantitative skills, Indigenous Canada relations, monitoring, all of these different things to, again, try and empower the next generation of fisheries and aquatic science practitioners. So we really, again, are taking these words, diversity, inclusive, science, partnership, and putting it into practice, and making sure that, again, if we can plan for it, and again, it won't happen by accident. We really want to plan for it and make it possible for the next generation to succeed. So I, again, extend my gratitude for listening to me today. I hope you have some ideas of how we can move forward in a good way, harnessing diversity. I'm hoping you have some ideas now for how if we make way for different ways of participating in science, we can start to see more impactful outcomes. Talking about ethical research in science teams, we need to normalize that. We need to also legitimize our approaches with science teams and other types of scientists and knowledge keepers. Some of the best case examples are when we can co-lead things together, when we can create spaces for different types of people in science teams, like a knowledge broker whose role is to help facilitate connections, so that experts, whether it be a benthic taxonomy expert or someone who can teach us how to work a canoe or electrofish, those experts, we need those experts, but we also need those connections. And through knowledge brokers, storytellers, and other types of roles, we can create these really well-connected teams. And again, by doing this local work, it is important that we think global. And so it's been a privilege to continue to be part of IPBES and the global places and reviewing things like the ecosystem approach. So I hope that, today you've seen so many different threads that speak to you, and seeing there's no one way to harness diversity. I'm hoping we can appreciate the most important thing is that we are intentional in how we weave them together. And I hope that today is an invitation for thinking about how can we move together in a good way and move in conversation and relationship with one another, as well as our land and water. So I wanted to thank you again for the invitation to speak today. Miigwech, maraming salamat, and thank you to the funders for supporting this work. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.